Mrs. Margaret swept through the marketplace, her posture regal, the sunlight catching on her flawless hair and polished shoes. Her face held a practiced smile, one designed to charm but never linger. The crowd parted subtly as her presence commanded unspoken respect. Yet, her gaze wasn't on the people around her. It was on the jewelry stalls, the fine silks, and the glint of wealth that beckoned to her from every corner. In the modest living room of their family home, Emma sat cross-legged on the worn carpet, her head bent over a pile of papers. Her pen scratched quietly as she jotted down notes, pausing every so often to adjust the baby blue scarf slipping from her hair. Across the room, Mrs. Margaret leaned back in a plush chair, eyes fixed on Emily. The younger girl twirled in front of a mirror, adjusting the neckline of her sequin dress. "That's my girl," Mrs. Margaret said, her voice filled with pride. She didn't even glance at Emma, who paused mid-sentence and glanced up, a flicker of hurt crossing her features before she lowered her gaze back to her work. At a family gathering, Emily floated through the room, her laughter clear and melodic. Mrs. Margaret stood nearby, her arm looped through Emily's, introducing her to distant relatives and family friends. "This is my Emily," she said, her smile unwavering. "She's everything a mother could dream of, poised, ambitious, and stunning." Emma sat on the far side of the room, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She caught snippets of the introductions and turned to stare out of the window, her profile framed by the soft light of the evening. Back home, Emily leaned against the doorframe of Emma's bedroom, her arms crossed. "Mama loves me more," she said, her tone playful but her smirk triumphant. Emma paused as she folded her clothes into neat piles, her hands trembling slightly before she continued without a word. Years passed, and the sisters' lives diverged like paths in a forest. Emma, clad in a simple wedding dress, walked down the aisle on Jaden's arm. His smile radiated warmth, his grip on her hand steady and reassuring. In their small but cozy home, Emma cooked dinner, her movements fluid and calm. Jaden appeared behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. Their laughter mingled with the aroma of home-cooked food, a melody of contentment. Meanwhile, Emily walked alongside Jack through a showroom, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Jack gestured to a sparkling chandelier, his tone confident as he discussed its placement in their mansion. Emily nodded, her expression calculating. Later, she lounged on the velvet chaise in their vast living room, flipping through a magazine while servants moved quietly around her. When Emma's baby arrived, her phone buzzed with unanswered messages to Mrs. Margaret. Emma cradled her newborn in her arms, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion but shining with love. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the screen as another message went unanswered. In Emily's mansion, Mrs. Margaret's suitcases sat open, their contents spilling out in vibrant silks and glittering jewelry. She clutched Emily's arm as they walked up the grand staircase. Her face glowed with awe as she admired the golden frames and sparkling chandeliers. The faint scent of lilies hung in the air. Weeks later, a loud crash echoed through the marble halls. Mrs. Margaret lay at the bottom of the staircase, her face pale and contorted in pain. Emily appeared moments later, her heels clicking against the floor. Her face held shock, but the slight tightness in her jaw betrayed her annoyance. Jack ordered the staff to call an ambulance, his tone clipped. Mrs. Margaret's days in the wheelchair were a blur of silence and subtle dismissal. Emily ensured her meals arrived on time, but avoided her gaze during conversations. One evening, laughter spilled from the living room. Mrs. Margaret wheeled herself in, her movements slow but determined. The room fell silent. Eyes darted to her, then back to Emily, whose face flushed crimson. "Oh, just an aunt," Emily said quickly, forcing a laugh. "She's here to help out." Mrs. Margaret's hands tightened on the armrests of the wheelchair. Back in the solitude of her room, her voice shook as she confronted Emily. Emily's cold reply cut through the air, leaving Mrs. Margaret to sit in the shadows of the grand bedroom, her reflection in the gilded mirror looking smaller than ever. Mrs. Margaret sat by the window, staring out at the gardens. Her wheelchair, now her constant companion, felt like a cage, its cold metal frame a constant reminder of her helplessness. Sophie the maid entered, quietly setting down a tray of food. She tried to offer a kind smile, but Mrs. Margaret barely noticed. The weight of the isolation pressed down on her, and the only thing that seemed to break through her despondency was the sound of Sophie's footsteps. "I've spoken to Emily," Sophie said gently, her voice a soft attempt to bring some comfort. "Maybe a little fresh air would help, just a walk in the garden." Mrs. Margaret's eyes flickered. She almost welcomed the thought, but then the sharp memory of Emily's command echoed in her mind. "I don't want the neighbors seeing her in a wheelchair," Emily had said. The harshness of those words settled on her like a weight. She shook her head, a mixture of frustration and regret flooding her. "I don't deserve it," she murmured. Sophie hesitated but didn't press further. She knew better than to challenge the stubbornness of her employer. Instead, she busied herself with arranging the meal, all the while glancing at Mrs. Margaret. The silence in the room felt thick. Meanwhile, across town, Emma stood by the door of her home, hand on the doorknob, waiting. Jaden was by her side, his comforting presence a steady anchor for her. When the phone call had come from Mrs. Margaret, Emma had almost dismissed it, but the tremble in her mother's voice stopped her cold. "Please, I need your help," Mrs. Margaret had pleaded, her vulnerability undeniable. After some time, Emma and Jaden had arrived at Emily's mansion. Emma took a deep breath as she stepped inside, the opulence of Emily's home far from the warmth of the home she had built with Jaden. Mrs. Margaret was tucked away, a shadow in the grand, lonely house. Emma moved toward her mother's room, her steps careful, gentle. She saw the disarray of Mrs. Margaret's things, everything packed in haste. Her eyes softened as she realized that despite the lavish home Emily had, it held no comfort for her mother. Without a word, Emma began packing what remained. Jaden, following suit, helped gather Mrs. Margaret's belongings. The act felt like an unspoken promise to mend the brokenness that had been left in the wake of the fractured relationships. When they finally arrived at their own home, Mrs. Margaret looked around in awe. Her gaze lingered on the simple, yet comforting surroundings. It wasn't the wealth of Emily's mansion, but something about it felt more familiar, more like home. Emma ushered her inside, the warmth of their lives together now wrapping around Mrs. Margaret like a soft blanket. "You're safe here," Emma said, a smile on her face. "Let me know if you need anything." Days passed. Mrs. Margaret spent time with Emma and Jaden, slowly recovering both physically and emotionally. The presence of the physical therapist, the care given to her every need, began to heal wounds she hadn't known existed. Mrs. Margaret sat in the living room with Emma and Jaden. The air felt peaceful, a contrast to the tension she had known. She hesitated, then spoke, her voice trembling with regret. "I was wrong," she said softly, her eyes misted with tears. "I let my obsession with wealth blind me to what truly matters." Emma sat beside her, reaching out to squeeze her hand. "You're my mother. That's all that matters." The words hung in the air, an unspoken promise between them. Emma could see the change in her mother, something softer, more aware. The bond between them had been fractured for so long, but now it was healing. Mrs. Margaret wasn't the woman she had once been. She wasn't perfect, but Emma could feel the shift in her heart. Then, the doorbell rang. Emma rose to answer it, her mind occupied by the comfort of the evening, unaware of the storm waiting behind the door. When she opened it, her heart skipped a beat. Emily stood there, her face streaked with tears, her makeup a mess. She clutched 2 suitcases tightly to her chest. "What are you doing here?" Emma asked, her tone wary but still soft. Emily's voice trembled as she sobbed. "I need your help," she cried, explaining how Jack had discovered her lies. She begged for forgiveness, telling Emma how she had been thrown out with nowhere to go, no money to her name. Emma paused, glancing over her shoulder at Mrs. Margaret, who had heard the commotion and was standing quietly behind her. Mrs. Margaret's face was unreadable, her eyes fixed on Emily. The air thickened, and for a long moment, there was only silence. Finally, Emma spoke, her words calm but firm. "You can stay, but only if you're willing to change. You need therapy, Emily. You need to confront what brought you to this point." Emily nodded, tears streaking down her face. She promised to change, to make amends, and to work on herself. The tension in the room slowly began to lift as Emma, despite the betrayal, offered her sister a chance. Days passed, and Emily began the difficult process of self-discovery. Therapy sessions helped her peel back the layers of her selfishness, and she started to understand the pain she had caused. As she spent time with her mother and sister, there was a new sense of vulnerability in her, one that Emma and Mrs. Margaret had not seen before. The days passed slowly, each one carrying an undercurrent of tension as Emily settled into Emma's home. The mansion, which once felt alive with the bustle of family and laughter, now seemed to press in on them, the heavy silence lingering in every corner. The walls, though elegant and grand, held a quiet sadness, reflecting the unsettled atmosphere between mother and daughter, and between Emily and herself. Emma, despite the weight of the situation, worked diligently. She moved about the house with a quiet determination, making sure that every space was organized, every meal prepared with care, and every moment taken to try and smooth over the awkwardness in the air. She never spoke about the tension, but did what she could to ease it. She knew her sister's shame ran deep, and Mama Margaret's heartache was even deeper. Each evening, after long hours of work, Emma would settle beside Emily, attempting small conversations, offering comfort without words, hoping that the silence would be broken. One evening, the air felt heavier than usual, thick with the unspoken words neither Emily nor Emma could bring themselves to say. They sat together in the living room, the faint flicker of the fireplace casting soft shadows across the space. Emily's gaze wandered, her hands resting tightly on her lap as though she could will herself to say what had been gnawing at her for so long. Her eyes shifted to Emma, the longing for connection evident in her expression. Emma, Emily's voice was soft, uncertain. How did you build this life? I always thought you were content with less. Her eyes stayed down, the question hanging between them like a fragile thread. Emma turned toward her, noting the quiet tremor in Emily's voice, the uncertainty that crept through her words. She sat back in her chair, her gaze meeting her sister's with a steady calm. Jaden and I worked hard, Emily, she answered, her voice grounded, steady. She smiled, her eyes softening as she spoke. We focused on what mattered, trust, respect, and building a future together. It wasn't about chasing wealth, but creating a home where we could be happy. Everything you see here is a result of that. Emily's gaze dropped, the weight of her own thoughts pulling her further inward. She bit her lower lip, her shoulders sinking with the depth of regret. I spent so much time trying to impress others, she whispered, almost to herself, chasing a life I thought would make me happy. But I see now how empty it all was. She paused, her voice faltering as the shame clung to her like a second skin. Across the room, Mama Margaret, who had been quietly listening from her seat by the window, inhaled deeply. The words Emily had spoken stung, but it was the way she said them that made Mama Margaret's heart tighten. Her throat caught, and her voice trembled as she finally spoke. Emily, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, I'm as much to blame. I encouraged you to value things over people. I wanted you to live the life I dreamed of, but I was wrong. I see that now. The quiet confession hung in the air, the weight of Mama Margaret's words sinking in. There was no rush to fill the silence that followed. Emily's face softened, her eyes wide with the realization of what Mama Margaret was offering. A shift had occurred, an unspoken understanding that would slowly begin to heal the fractures between them. In the days that followed, Emily began the painful journey of therapy. Each session brought her face to face with uncomfortable truths about her life, her choices, and the years of validation-seeking that had shaped her. She cried, often, as she uncovered layers of her identity built on seeking approval, especially from Mama Margaret. But there was a spark of resolve in her too. She could feel it deep within her, the drive to change, to rebuild herself. Meanwhile, Mama Margaret, too, began to reflect on her own life. Emma had suggested she see a counselor, but Mama Margaret hesitated at first, unsure of what she might uncover or if she was strong enough to face the pain of her past. But after much persuasion from Emma, she agreed, stepping into her own journey of healing. In her sessions, She unearthed the deep-seated fears that had driven her obsession with wealth. Her own impoverished childhood, the constant feeling of not being enough, the haunting memories of lost opportunities. All of it had shaped her, hardened her, and made her afraid to love or be loved in return. One afternoon, the air felt different. Mama Margaret sat with Emma in the garden after her therapy session, her gaze distant as she looked toward the horizon. The sun bathed them in a warm glow, its rays casting long shadows over the neatly trimmed hedges. The scent of blooming jasmine filled the air, but Mama Margaret's mind was far from the tranquility around them. Emma, her voice was thick with emotion, the words coming slowly. I realize now that I pushed you away because you reminded me of everything I wasn't. Your humility, your kindness. They scared me. She paused, the weight of her confession heavy in the stillness of the garden. I didn't know how to love you because I didn't love myself. Emma's heart ached as she reached out, taking her mother's hand into hers. Her touch was gentle, yet firm, conveying forgiveness without words. Mama, I've forgiven you. What matters now is that we move forward together, Emma said softly, her gaze warm, filled with understanding. The days turned into weeks, and as Emily continued therapy, she began to take steps, small, tentative steps, toward mending the broken relationships she had with her family. She volunteered to help around the house, cleaning, cooking, and offering her assistance wherever needed. Her culinary skills, while far from perfect, brought a sense of lightness to the home. The laughter that bubbled up when she served a less-than-perfect meal was a sound that slowly began to fill the house again. One day, Emily stood in the kitchen, stirring a pot with a determined look on her face. She turned to Emma, her eyes bright with a new energy. "I want to find a job," she said, her voice steady, no longer clouded by indecision. "Not just any job. I want to do something meaningful, something that gives back." Emma looked up from the kitchen counter, her face lighting up with pride. She set down the knife she had been using to chop vegetables and turned fully toward Emily. "That's a wonderful idea, Emily. What are you thinking?" Emily bit her lip, a hint of excitement flickering in her eyes. "I've always loved organizing events. Maybe I could start a business planning charity galas or fundraisers." Emma smiled, nodding in approval. "You have the charm and skills for it. I believe in you," she said, her voice filled with conviction. With Emma's support, Emily knew she had the strength to face what lay ahead. She took the first steps, not just to rebuild her life, but to make it count, not only for herself but for the people around her. Emily entered the bustling cafe, her phone pressed to her ear as she exchanged pleasantries with a potential client. As she ended the call, her eyes scanned the room, taking in the buzz of conversations and the clinking of coffee cups. With a purposeful stride, she approached the corner table where a small group of event organizers had gathered. She exchanged brief smiles, the room pulsing with the energy of possibility. Soon, her first gig materialized, a fundraiser for a local children's hospital. She immersed herself in the event planning, organizing every detail with precision. The day of the event arrived, and the venue hummed with excitement. Volunteers moved around, setting up booths and decorations, while guests milled about in their finest attire. Emily, with a satisfied smile, watched as everything fell into place. The event was a success, and for the first time in years, a feeling of fulfillment washed over her, not because of the attention or accolades, but because it had been done for the right reasons. Months passed, and the atmosphere in the house gradually shifted. Mama Margaret, who had once been confined to the quiet of recovery, now spent her days in the garden with Emma. The sunlight danced through the leaves, casting long shadows as Margaret's laughter joined Emma's. Their shared moments were the echoes of a life slowly rebuilt. Inside the house, Emily adjusted to her new role as a thriving business owner. The sounds of typing on her laptop and calls with clients became routine, and as her business grew, so did her confidence. She worked late into the night, often joined by Emma or Margaret, who supported her in ways she had once doubted. One evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, the house was alive with the savory smells of roasted chicken and freshly baked bread. The laughter was easy, the silence comfortable as they reminisced about old family stories. The conversation meandered through memories of shared holidays and childhood pranks, until it softened into quiet smiles and a reflective pause. Mama Margaret raised her glass, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I want to say something," she began, her voice quivering with emotion. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the glass steady. "This past year has taught me more than all the years before it. I've learned that wealth is meaningless without love, and the greatest treasures are the people we hold dear. Emily, thank you for giving me another chance." The room quieted as the sincerity of her words washed over them. Emma and Emily met their mother's gaze and clinked glasses with her, their hearts full of warmth. "To new beginnings," Emma said, her voice steady with emotion. Emily, her smile gentle, echoed, "To family." As the months rolled by, the connection between them only deepened. Emily's career flourished, and she used her platform to raise awareness about causes close to her heart, like elder care and family reconciliation. Her events became more than just parties. They were catalysts for change. Margaret, now a proud grandmother, stood beside her daughters at community events. She shared her story, a cautionary tale of how easy it was to lose sight of what truly mattered. Emma, the quiet force that held the family together, observed with a deep sense of pride as everything fell into place. The fractures that once seemed irreparable were now healed, their past woven together into a beautiful mosaic of love, hope, and forgiveness. The house was no longer weighed down by the burdens of the past. Instead, it buzzed with laughter and shared moments, each one building on the last. Emma, Emily, and Margaret had found what they had long searched for, each other. The wealth they had once thought was everything was now only a shadow of what they truly valued. In the end, family had proven to be the greatest treasure of all. Their story became a living testament to the power of redemption, forgiveness, and the unbreakable bond of love. As they moved forward, they ensured that the mistakes of the past would never again define them. Together, they created a future built on the understanding that love and forgiveness, above all, were the true measures of wealth. And with that, their story continued, not in the shadows of the past, but in the light of a new beginning. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you did, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought about the story. See you in the next video, and don't forget to share it with friends and family who love heartfelt tales.